Hey everybody. A lot of you know I recently went through a traumatic experience with my discus. They broke out in some sort of disease and illness, and I wasn't sure what was going on. And by its initial appearance, it sort of looked a little bit like ick. And if I were a less experienced fish keeper, I may have then begun treating the fish for ick, and that would have been disastrous because what they had was not actually ick. And the reason I knew for certain that it was not ick was because that I had not introduced any new fish into the aquarium in a very long time, and therefore that in itself rules out the possibility of ick. And that's what I want this video to be about, is the idea that ick sort of lurks in our tank. I've often heard people say that they had a sudden outbreak of ick. There is no such thing as a sudden outbreak of ick. You either have ick in your tank because you've introduced it into your tank by way of new fish that were diseased when you brought them in, or your tank doesn't have it in there. There is no scenario where you're going to go 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 months with no problem and then suddenly you're going to have ick in your tank. That does not happen. Ick has a very well understood and known life cycle, and it is a host dependent parasite. It cannot live outside the fish's body except during its reproductive phase. And we'll discuss that, and then by the end of the discussion you'll understand how it's just impossible for ick to live in your aquarium for any length of time undetected. If it's in your aquarium, you're going to see it on your fish. If you don't see it on your fish, it's not in your aquarium. That's as simple as it is with ick. It just gets confused quite often. So with the life cycle of ick, we're going to start with it already being in the fish. Let's say you've brought a fish home from the pet store, it's got ick, you don't realize it has ick, and you put it right into your aquarium. So what ick is, it's a little protozoan parasite that burrows into the fish's flesh and eats the fish's flesh. It feeds on the fish. When it's ready to go into its reproductive stage, it burrows out of the fish, it falls to the bottom of the tank, it encases itself or encapsulates itself in a cyst that stays down in the substrate, or it sticks to plants or gravel or whatever. It secretes a sticky substance so it doesn't get washed away in the current. And so after a period of time of reproduction within this cyst, you have the cell division going on, and so 2 becomes 4, becomes 8, becomes 16, and so very, very quickly you begin multiplying this organism. And when the cyst can no longer contain all of the growing organisms in there, it ruptures, and all of those organisms come back out into the water column and immediately begin looking for a host. They have about 3 days to find a fish to burrow into. If they do not find a fish to burrow into within that 3-day window, they die. If they do find a fish to burrow into, they burrow into it, and that whole cycle starts over again. And this is why out in nature you seldom see fish that are covered in ick. In a large body of water, a fish that has ick on it is they're gonna fall out of its body, they're gonna reproduce, and then when those little free swimmers come up into a river or a lake, the distribution of fish and the likelihood of them finding a fish in that short window is pretty small, and so only a few of them ever find fish, and so the fish never get overwhelmed with these parasites. Whereas in an aquarium, when they erupt out of their breeding cycle on the bottom of the tank, you have hundreds or possibly thousands of those free swimmers right in your aquarium, and there's nowhere for your fish to go. There's nowhere for the ick to go. It goes right into your fish, and that's why that cycle seems to, they go from a few specks on them, within a week they've got specks all over them. However, if there's no fish, there's no ick. And if there's no ick, it's not in the tank. It has to be part of that cycle. And that whole entire cycle at our tropical aquarium temperatures, that whole entire cycle only lasts about 10 days, maybe 12 to 14 days tops, 2 weeks, and it's over. So if you've put new fish in your tank and 2 or 3 weeks have gone by and you don't see any signs of ick in the tank, then you don't have ick in the tank. If 6 or 7 months goes by and you suddenly have an outbreak of white spots all over your fish, it's not ick. It's just not ick. Ick does not live in your tank dormant, waiting for some thing to happen or the conditions to be right. There are other organisms that do that, however. There are other organisms that live in your tank that will sort of explode into growth. Think of the way if you overfeed a tank, your snail population will go out of control, or if you've got too high nutrient loads, your algae will grow out of control. It's always there. It's just not growing out of control because the conditions aren't conducive for it to grow out of control. And there is another organism that does live in our tanks. It's called Epistylus. I'm not going to get into a big discussion about that now, but I will put a link to that down below. And if I haven't already, I'll attach a card that gives some very good information about this disease. It's very common. It looks a lot like ick, and it will sort of erupt into your tank if the conditions are right. It's not actually attacking your fish, but we'll get into that in another video. We'll talk more in depth about this Epistylus, because I think that is far, far more common than ick. And I think people confuse that with ick, and they treat it for ick, and then it doesn't work because it's not actually ick, and then their fish die, and then they blame it on ick, and they say that fish died from ick. First of all, ick is fairly benign. It's not very deadly at all. To have a fish die from ick, you've got to be really, really neglectful. It takes weeks for that to happen. Ick rarely kills fish. It rarely kills fish. It's just not that bad of a disease for fish to get. So when you have people that say, oh, I had ick and it wiped out my entire tank, they probably were dealing with something else that they thought was ick. Or if they say, you know, I noticed a few white spots on my fish and 3 days later they were dead, that's not ick. Ick does not behave that way. And again, they probably were dealing with something else. And I don't want to get into talking too much about this Epistylus. I feel like this has already been a long enough video. But the Epistylus is a little more complicated. It can mimic ick. It can look like fungal infections. It can look like a lot of stuff in your tank. So you really need to know what you're looking at. But ick is seldom more than a nuisance. It's very easy to treat. It's seldom deadly, and it will not be in your tank if you have not introduced any new animals. There is no dormant period for ick. It does not just live in our tanks at all times. That is not how it works. That's like if you go outside and get mosquito bites. You don't have mosquitoes living on your body all the time and they're just waiting for the conditions to be right. You went somewhere where that parasite was and that parasite bit you. If you don't bring those parasites to where you are, you can't get attacked by them. And it's the same thing with ick. Ick is a physical parasite that needs to be in the animal. And if it's not in the animal, it's not going to be living. So there's no way it can just stay in your tank dormant for any period of time. Now, having said that, for the sake of thoroughness, I'll throw out the one caveat is that the ick's life cycle is temperature dependent. So the lower the temperature goes, the slower that whole process goes. And if you get down into temperatures, which the tropical fish keeping community does not, but if you get down into temperatures into the low 60s or upper 50s, now that whole life cycle of ick takes several months. And so if for some reason you have a 55-degree fish tank and you dealt with ick and then it went away and you didn't see it, and then 6 months later it erupted into your tank again, well, first of all, 55 degrees, it ain't going to erupt at all. It's going to be very slow moving. But that would be the scenario. It's part of that same life cycle. It just took 6 months for that reproductive cycle to go through because your water is so cold in the tank. At 72 degrees, 73 degrees, room temperature kind of tanks, anything above 70 degrees, and that whole life cycle is going to happen in 2 weeks. So again, if you don't see white spots all over your fish, if you don't see ick in your tank, then it's simply not in your tank. If it is in your tank, then it has to be part of your fish's life cycle. It's got to be feeding on your fish at some point, so you will see spots on your fish if it's in your tank. If you don't see spots on your fish, it's not there. It's just as simple as that. I cannot state that enough, and I know I'm going to get people telling me I'm wrong, and they've had experiences where they've had a tank that was stable for 2 or 3 years, and then suddenly ick broke out, and I'm telling them before they even comment, it wasn't ick. I'm not arguing with you that you didn't have some white spots appear on your fish, but it wasn't ick. I'm not arguing with you that you didn't have your fish suddenly die, but it wasn't ick that did it. Ick is not that deadly, and it does not stay dormant in our tanks, period. If something broke out in your tank after months, It wasn't ick. So give me your thoughts down below. I'm sure I'm going to hear all the stories about the ick that broke out in somebody's tank after 6 months anyway, despite the fact that I just explained that that's not what happened to you. But tell me about it anyway, and we can have a conversation about it. My next video, I'm going to focus more on talking about the Epistylus, because that, I believe, is far, far more common than people experiencing ick. And more importantly than just being more common, it's more readily confused. When people see the white spots, they think it's ick, and they start treating for ick. It leads to the myth that ick lives in our tank dormant, and it also leads to the myth that ick is some deadly disease that wipes out tanks of fish. Ick does not do those things, but other things will, and those other things can mimic ick. So it's important that we start looking at these different things and breaking them down and saying this is what ick is, and this is something different. So in the next video, we're going to talk about the something different, and it's called Epistylus. And again, I'll put a link down below, or there's probably already one up above me or something like that. It's a good article. It's worth reading. It's a little lengthy, but it's packed full of good information. So read it, learn it, know it. It'll save some of your fish in the future, I promise you. All right, everybody, that's it for today. Thanks for watching. Make sure you subscribe. Don't forget, I do a live stream every Friday and Sunday night, 8 p.m. Eastern Time. In my next live stream, I am going to be making a brief announcement about a new format for my live streams. Not necessarily a format, but you'll see. I got some information about how I'm going to be doing my live streams from now going forward. So make sure you're subscribed, ring that bell, all that good YouTube stuff. Thanks for watching this one, and I'll see you real soon on the next one.